Well, we want to talk about the first session. Whoever was at the first session, we talked about who was there. And we said it was the nation of Israel, Segula, to be the treasured nation, that the Almighty was speaking to the nation of Israel, the Bnei Israel, and to give them their mandate before they went into the land of Israel. Now, what I wanted to talk about today is what was revealed. There's a lot of confusion, and the confusion is that we think it was the Ten Commandments. We say, okay, the Jewish people got the Ten Commandments at Mount Sinai. We talked about that a little bit last time. And it's not that clear, because in our synagogues, in our synagogue service tomorrow night, we're going to have the special prayers for the festival, and it's going to be Zman Toratenu, Matan Toratenu, the time of the giving of our Torah. So on one hand, we think God revealed the Ten Commandments, but the Jewish people call it the time of the giving of our Torah. We received the Torah at Sinai. So which is it? Did we get the Ten Commandments, or did we get the Torah? Now, the problem is, we know that it can't be the Torah. Meaning, if you're calling the Torah, we use the word Torah in many different ways, and it can get very confusing. In the same way, we use the word Israel, and it's used in many different ways, and it can get confusing. When we say the word Torah, what conjures up in most people's heads is a scroll with the 5 books of Moses. The 5 books of Moses is the Torah, the written Torah. That's what most people think when they hear the word Torah. But it really means, we're going to get to it a little bit later, it really means something different. And sometimes we use the word Torah, and we're referring to the entire Old Testament, the Torah, the prophets, and the writings. We call that the written Torah. So we have the 5 books of Moses called the Torah, the Sefer Torah, the book of Torah. We have the Old Testament, which is the 5 books of Moses, the prophets, and the writings, which include the Megillot, the book of Esther, the book of Proverbs, etc. We call that the written Torah. Then when we say Torah, we also will mean, and we're going to talk about this in a little bit, the oral Torah. We're going to have a question: what did we get first, the written Torah or the oral Torah? What's the oral Torah? The oral Torah is going to be detailed explanations of the 613 commandments, which we refer to into the written Torah. So we call that Torah also. And in fact, the entire corpus of everything, we call it Torah. So we use this word lots of ways, and that's why it can be confusing. But we say this is the time of the giving our Torah, and hopefully by the end of our session today, you'll understand why the Jewish people say this is the time of the giving of our Torah. Because it can't be the 5 books of Moses. Why? Can't be the 5 books of Moses because we're in the book of Exodus. We're just into the book of Exodus in chapter 20 at Revelation at Sinai. And then you got all of the middle book, all of the Midbar, all of Numbers, and all of Deuteronomy, which takes 40 years. So you don't actually, Moses didn't receive the story of what he was going to do about hitting a rock later. You see what I'm saying? The whole story about fighting Amalek with the hands up and down, that's not going to happen for a long time into the future. He didn't get that at Sinai, because if it did, how did he have free will? He couldn't have free will. If it was all written down what was going to happen before it happened, he doesn't have free will. So it wasn't written down until the end of the 40 years, the written Torah. You follow what I'm saying? The 5 books of Moses we didn't get until the end of the 40 years of the desert. The revelation at Sinai happened at the beginning of the story, for 49 days after we exited Egypt. 50th day. Do you see the problem? Okay, so did we get the 10 commandments on the tablets? No, because we're going to see they got revelation. Moses goes up onto the mountain for 40 days. And he comes down with the tablets from the Almighty, and he sees them with the golden calf, and he gets angry, and he drops them, and they shatter, right? So that's 40 days later. And then he goes up for another 40 days. We're going to talk about what he was doing for those 80 days. It wasn't like he couldn't be playing on his games on his cell phone. What was he doing for 40 days and nights and another 40 days and 40 nights? No TV, no internet. What was he doing? We're going to talk about that. So he comes down again with the tablets that he made this time, not with the finger of God. And they're ultimately going to get put into the Ark of the Covenant. So we didn't get that. So what did we get? What did we hear? All right. So before we talk about what, and this is the chiddush, this is the novelty, the new thing that I wanted to talk about. It's important for us to understand why. Why did there need to be a revelation at Sinai? Jewish people came out of Egypt. God promised them the land. So take them out of Egypt, take them straight to the land. What do we need this revelation at Sinai for? That's going to be the key. That's going to be a key to understanding what we got. Because if you know why you have to get something, that's going to be half the answer or 90% of the answer of what you need to get, right? If I know we're going to have a gift-giving party, and because you're going to be a football player in the NFL, that's going to be an indication about what I'm going to give you before you go into the NFL, right? So if I know why, if I don't know why the party's happening, it's arbitrary what you're getting as a gift. So why do the Jewish people why are they coming to Sinai, and why do they need to get the gift? What's it all about? All right, so I'm going to share my screen now. So the context is hugely important. Why did the Jewish people need to experience the revelation at Sinai? So we saw in the first session, God says to them in Exodus 19, and in Exodus 20, we're going to actually have God speaking. In Exodus 19, God says, I want you to come, and in order that you can become a holy nation, Goy Kadosh, a treasured people, Am Segula Mikol Amim, treasured from amongst all the nations, a Mamlechet Kohanim, a kingdom of priests. We talked about that in the last session, and we said that it was separate in order to have a spiritual connection with the Almighty, in order to share that with the other nations. That was the job. The Jewish people came out as the Bechor. God says to Paro, Beni Bechori Yisrael, my son is my firstborn, is Israel, and the firstborn's job is to learn what the parent wants and share what the parent wants in the language that the siblings can understand, the will of the parent, and create the bond. That's what we're supposed to be. All right? So if you're going to be that, how do you become a holy nation? It's like, okay, I'm going to be holy. I'm going to be treasured. I'm going to teach my siblings. So what do I need in order to be able to do that? How do you become a Goy Kadosh, a holy nation? You need to have the instructions. I need to know what to do. Dad, Mom, if you're going away on vacation and I'm in charge of the house and I have to explain to the siblings tell me what you need. I need to have an instructions, a general user's guide, right? And I need to know the details. Anybody, if you I'm looking forward to getting my gimbal, that little gizmo that's going to, that little gizmo that's going to hold my camera, my cell phone from jiggling around. Now, most people will pull it out of the box, plunk on their cell phone, and try to use it. So if I'm smart, what I want to do, it's a complicated thing. That's what my siblings are going to do. I want my siblings just to take it and start using it. So what do I need? From the manufacturer, I need the general user's guide, so I know all of the general principles. And then and some people will be willing to read that. But then the geeky ones like us, like me, I'm going to go read the entire detailed user's manual You know, you get the guide and then you get the manual. So I'm going to read the guide on my little gimbal, and then I'm going to open up the user's manual and go into the deep dive. And you know what? I might even go onto YouTube and find some video tutorials on how to use this thing the best. And then I'm going to become the expert. And then if any of you decides to get one, you're going to say, Shmuel, I want to get one of those gimbals too. Can you show me how to use it? And then I'm going to use simple language, translate from the detailed user's manual with all the geeky, techie language that's impossible to understand, and I'll show you how to do it. That's what it means to be a Kohen. But when a Kohen is not just a teacher of gimbals, a Kohen is a teacher of God, right? Teaches you about God. So in order for me to teach about God, I need God's instruction guide. I need the user's manual, the simple one, the summary of all of the functions, and then I need the detailed user's guide. At the national level, what do you need as a nation? If you're going to work together and accomplish your mission as a nation, you need a constitution that we can all, that's short summary, right? And then you need to have your legal code in order to function as a society, right? America's going through tremendous upheaval these days in America, because if you want to change and adapt or reinterpret the Constitution, and how does that affect the legal code? And there's fractionalization within American society today. It's unbelievable what's going on. If you don't have an agreed upon general principles like your Constitution, and you don't have an agreed upon understanding what those rights mean, there's a huge debate, right? Roe v. Wade, is it constitutional? Is it not, right? Yeah, in the Constitution. This one says it's not. Because you need to have a detailed understanding of each law, how it relates back to the Constitution, so you can all agree. So if you want to be a society with a mission that has a particular mandate, you need to have your Constitution and your legal code. Now, the word Torah, I'm going to come back here and share my screen. The word Torah, you with me here? Means instructions. The word lehorot. Lehorot is the infinitive. It's the verb. Any English teachers out there? Okay. Lehorot means to instruct or to teach. So the word moreh, here it is in Hebrew, means an instructor or a teacher. This is review from last seminar, for whoever was here the last time. So now, if you're a teacher, anybody here teachers? I think we have a few teachers. I know Lindsay was a teacher. You probably have a few teachers. Sherry, you a teacher? All right. So if you have a teacher and you got a group of students, to succeed as a student, the teacher will give you what? Or the principal gives you when you start up in a new school? Rules for the classroom with consequences if you break them. You have to be able to function safely and clearly as a society. You need to have information and instructions on how to solve your math problems, right? So I need instruction, how to solve problems. I need to have rules of how the group's going to work. And there's going to be customs for the classroom. I know when my daughters were little and they were in nursery school, and they'd have 20 little girls, and they would have birthday parties, right? So they didn't want to have kids feeling left out. So they didn't want them to have birthday parties at home and invite friends. If you did, you had to invite everybody in the class. That was one of the rules. Another rule was when it was your birthday, they had a little party at the school, and the birthday girl had to bring gifts to give to all of the friends. Being special on your birthday meant you were a giver, not a taker, right? Actually, similar in Halloween, it's all about taking candy. On Purim, we go around giving mishloach manot, we give presents. You want to be a giver, not a taker. So that they had rules for the culture in the classroom, right? Okay, to create a culture within your society. Now we move on to a horeh, a parent. A horeh means parent, which is seen as a teacher of life wisdom to his or her children. So what does the parent want? And this is key, and this is going to be our key to understanding the purpose of creation, why God put us here, and why this whole thing happened in Sinai. A parent wants their children to experience the pleasures they have in their own lives by earning those experiences on their own, the child, and avoiding the pitfalls in life. I remember when I was in my 20s, you know that picture that I showed you of me standing at Mount Sinai? I was like young with lots of hair, and I was working in the computer field. That was a catch. And I remember my mother, a blessed memory, she'd always say, no, no, right? Like, when am I going to bring home a girl? When am I going to get married? So here's my mistake. I always thought that my mother wanted me to get married and have children because she was ready for grandchildren. That's what I thought before I got married. You know what I realized after I got married and had my own kids? The greatest pleasure in my mother's life was her family and her children. She loved me so much, she wanted me to have the most pleasure in life. And she knew that if I got married and had my own children, that would give me the tremendous pleasure that she had. And that's why she wanted me to get married and have kids. Not, well, maybe a little bit because she wanted grandchildren. But you see that? You see that? And when I did have it, it created such a tremendous bond with my mother and father that I never had before, because now I had this experience. I understood. I got my mother. I didn't get my mother before. You follow that? So by experiencing what my parent is instructing me to do for my own benefit and my own pleasure, not only will it be for my own pleasure, but it will create the bond with my parent. Okay? That's a parent-child relationship. And what do we do as children? We go, yeah, sure, and go and do our own thing and get into all kinds of trouble. And eventually we come around and we say, oh, no, I get it. Yeah, you were right all along, right? So if we listen to the instructions, we can avoid the pain. It's called the school of hard knocks for good reason, right? If I can go to school without the hard knocks, hey, why not? What it means is I got to give up a little bit of my ego and not think that I'm always right. All right. Now, let's talk about Torah. Torah's instructions, instructions for living, wisdom for life. So did we only get Torah, instructions for living at Mount Sinai? No. The concept of Torah is instructions for living. Instructions from whom? From the parent. Who's our parent? Avinu Shebashamayim, the Almighty, the King of the universe, is our Father. He's the Father of humanity. In order for us to get the maximal out of life, we need him to explain to us how to get the most out of life and have the maximal pleasure in life, and therefore have the biggest bond with him. Just like that analogy I gave you with me and my mother. The Almighty wants us to have pleasure. He put us in the Garden of Eden. Eden is pleasure, delight. That's where he put us. He wanted us to have pleasure. So Adam, we go back all the way to Adam. He was created to take pleasure in a relationship with God. Litaneg al Hashem. To take pleasure in a relationship with the Almighty. We'll have a whole session on that one time to understand that, how that's so. But what it means is the more God-like I am, the more I'm going to relate to God and have pleasure in that relationship. Just like I gave the example of me having kids and taking pleasure in having my relationship with my parents. Took it up a level. So the problem is, if we have to figure out on our own how to get the maximal pleasure out of life, we're physical beings trapped in a physical world. Our soul is trapped in a physical body in a physical world. We can only act in the physical world. God is this almighty transcendent being outside of time and space. He's a spiritual entity. So the more I'm involved in the physical world, the more it's going to take me away from being spiritual in and of itself. So what I need God to do, I need the manufacturer to say, listen, if you do these things, those are the things that are going to make you feel close to me. If you do those things, those are going to take you away from me. So God gave Adam instructions. Adam had instructions in the Garden of Eden. How did he get them? Via prophecy. This is key. Adam was a prophet. He didn't have the same kind of a body that we did. He was a very spiritual being. They were spiritual beings. We'll talk about it one time. Their body wasn't made with skin that we have today. It was made out of light. And that's a metaphor saying there was no tangible barrier between their neshama, their soul, and the Almighty, which meant prophecy. Prophecy is when you can perceive God clearly and objectively. So he got the instructions how to interact with the physical world and to succeed in his relationship with God. Eat from all the trees, be fruitful and multiply. Don't eat from that tree in the center of the garden. The tree of knowledge of good and evil. We'll talk about that one day. The tree of knowledge of good and evil represented getting wisdom about life through the school of hard knocks. Do it on your own without God. Forget about what God says. I'll go into the world. I'll do it myself. I'll be God-like. I'll figure it out on my own. That's what the tree of knowledge of good and evil was all about. So they got into trouble because they chose to be like God on their own terms. The Nachash, the serpent, said, you eat from this, you're going to be like Elohim. You're going to be like God. And they said, well, wait a second. God wanted me to be like God. What could be so bad? So they ate. They made a mistake. We'll talk about it one day. I'll do a whole session on it, if you like, on what happened in the Garden of Eden, how they made the mistake and why. It's really an interesting story. And it wasn't an apple, people. There's no apple in the story. Okay? In the Torah, you'll read the Torah, there's no apple. We have 4 choices what it could be. I don't want to delay now. All right. So once they eat from it and they say, we want to do it on our own terms, you know what God as a good parent said? All right, you want to do it on your own? You're on your own. Go on your own. And he sends them into exile. He sends them out of the garden and said, go figure it out on your own. But what you have to figure out on your own for the rest of history is how to get back to the garden. And come around and say, oh, God, you were right all along. That's what all of the rest of history is all about, to fix that mistake. But to fix that mistake by coming to the consciousness and repairing the damage. Instead of doing things because I think it's good for me, I want to do things because it's going to help my relationship with the Almighty. All right? So they come out with their mitzvahs. There are actually 6 commandments that he has, not to have any idols, right? Not to blaspheme God's name, not to murder, not to steal, no adultery, and set up a system of courts and justice. That's what Adam has. Now we have society lasts for a while until we get to the time of Noach. Noach also had Torah. His Torah for his context. Torah means instructions for living. Depending upon where you live and who's around you and what your goal is, you're going to have a different instruction set. So Noach had his particular instruction set for his place and his time. So when Adam and Eve were in exile from the Garden of Eden, it was harder to perceive God because everything became much more material. And the world was operating at the tribal level, clans. We hadn't developed into civilizations and cities, complex societies. Before you develop into complex society, one individual can be the role model for our other individuals because we're basically living as individuals in small groups. So if I want to set an example, I don't want to force somebody to be good. God gave us free will. So the last thing you want to do as a spiritual being is force somebody else to be spiritual. God doesn't force us. He wants us to choose it. That's why it's taking so many thousands of years to fix the mistake of Adam. Because God doesn't want to force us. He wants us to choose it. So, so one person could set the example. Noach was called Ish Tzaddik Tamim Haya B'Dorotav. He was a righteous person who was choosing to be connected to God in his generation. He had the ability to set the example for the rest of humanity. But what happened is they didn't listen. He was a prophet. He heard from the Almighty because he got his ego out of the way. He did what the Almighty wanted, and he got to the level of prophecy where he understood God wanted him to build this teva, this ark, rescue it. And hopefully by building this, he would get people's attention and they'd ask questions and he'd answer them and he'd get them to change their ways. It didn't work. Okay. So the world is destroyed except for Noach and his family. He has the same Torah as Adam Arishon, those 6 commandments, and God gives him an extra one, meaning now you're allowed to eat from animals. We can explain one, I'll explain another seminar. They're allowed to eat from animals, but if you're going to eat from animals, you have to be not cruel to it, and you have to slaughter it before you start carving it up and eating it, right? No throwing, no sort of just tearing off limbs off a live animal and eating it. They used to do that in the ancient world when you didn't have refrigeration. Romans used to do this. You don't have refrigerators, you want a leg of lamb. If you kill the whole lamb, by the time you finished eating one, 2 days later, everything's rotten. So they would cut off a limb, put a, what do you call that? To cut off the blood flow, and then cut off another limb the next day, 2 days later, and another one. That's what they used to do. God says, you can't do that. You can't do that. So that's what Noah had, and rebuild society. Now, Noah had to try to rebuild society as a monotheistic world, and he failed. What happened? You see, the Tower of Babel story happens. What does humanity do with this opportunity? They unite, but they end up building this tower to compete with God, saying, we'll be God. Same mistake that Adam made. We'll do it on our own. We can compete with God. So they get dispersed. And along comes Abraham. Abraham had Torah also. How did Abraham have Torah? The world had developed into complex societies. There's cities. One individual can't do it. So God knows that there's going to have to be a society that can set an example for society. One individual can't set an example for a police system and a government and an educational system. And one person can't do that. So in order for the world to be changed and brought under the kingdom of heaven, of God, you need to have a society that's going to set the example for the society. So Abraham comes along. Abraham figures out through objective observation of the world, through looking at the world objectively, not through his own egocentric point of view, he comes up with the idea that there had to have been a designer of this world, that the idols in his father's idol shop didn't have any power. His father's making money selling idols to people, and he sees that they have no power. They're just statues. It's ridiculous. So he works it through. Abraham works it through. And he comes to the conclusion in a pagan world that paganism is ridiculous. He, without receiving a tradition from his fathers, because his father chose to break away from the tradition of Noah and Shem and Ever, he came up with this idea. He understood the purpose of creation was to have a relationship with the one creator of the universe. And there's no gods in the world that have any power independent of God. And what did he do? He started reaching out to the pagans in Ur-Kasdim, down in that part of Iraq. And he was bringing them to monotheism and away from paganism. And because of this objective view of the world, he achieved the level of prophecy, right? We're going to see this a little bit later on. He achieved the level of prophecy, and God reaches out to him and says, Abraham, leave the land where you're from, go to a place I'm going to show you, and you're going to build a nation. You're going to have like stars in the sky, seas on sand on the seashore. He makes the covenant with him. And you will be the father of a holy nation, a distinct, separate nation dedicated to teaching the world about monotheism. Unbelievable. So if he's going to be a nation, he needs a land and a language and a history. So God needs to give him a land to set up this nation. The language is the language of creation, Lashon HaKodesh, the holy language. So he sends him there, and he comes here. And they're going to be a kingdom of priests. And he makes a covenant with them, the covenant of circumcision. It's interesting, it's not coincidence where the circumcision is, because the idea is we're supposed to operate within the physical world, but not be a slave to our desires, our physical desires and lusts. So we circumscribe on the circumcision, and this is the sign of the covenant that we are dedicated to create a nation. Our mandate is to create a nation of monotheism, to teach the world about monotheism, and that we use the world for spiritual reasons and not for its own material intrinsic value. That's our job. Okay? Now, here's a key point. God says, I'm going to give this land to you. And Abraham comes up with the strangest comment in my book in all of the Bible. Here's God, the almighty creator of the universe. He knows who he is he's talking to. He can control everything. Nothing, no power in the world other than God. And God says, Abraham, I'm giving the land to you and your descendants. And what does Abraham answer? Elsie, you know? He says, B'ma eda. How do I know? What is this? He's the father of the faith. He's the father of trusting in God. He left everything. He was a rich person. His father was the big honcho selling the idols. He was famous. He had a famous name. He left everything because he trusted God. Didn't even know where he was going. And now God says, okay, you're here. See this land where I brought you to? It's your land is for your children and your children's children forever. And he says, how do I know? Out of character, right? So God immediately says, oh, what's your problem? Avram was concerned that his descendants might not merit the land. Because you see, we need the land in order to live a monotheistic life and teach the world how to live a monotheistic life. What if his descendants start eating pork and hunting and raping and pillaging? Then there's no reason for them to have the land, and they'll get vomited out, and they might, you know what I'm saying, and never come back. So Avram's worried about that. He says, it's not how do I know that how do I know that they're not, through their own free choice, aren't going to go off track and then lose the merit of the land? God says, oh, you want a covenant. You don't want a promise. You want a covenant. What's a covenant? Where no matter what, even if one side's in breach, the other side will still keep the bargain. You want a covenant? That's serious. You got to pay the price for a covenant, right? You want your descendants forever, always to understand that there's no power in the world other than God? So that's the covenant of the parts. He puts them into a deep sleep. He has this vision, split the parts of the animals. They walk through. That's how you cut a covenant in the ancient times. And God says to him, but you should know, surely know, that your children are going to go to a strange land and they're going to be subjugated over there. But in the end, it'll work out okay. They'll come out with great wealth. They're going to have to go through a national experience that's going to burn into their consciousness that there's no power in the world other than God. And in that merit, when they pay that price, then forever the covenant will be eternal with them. And no matter what happens, no matter how far away they get, how far they get dispersed, I will bring them back to the land. That's the covenant. All right. Now we get to Moses. Moses is an interesting character because as a baby gets brought up in the palace, in the Egyptian palace, and all the splendor and the wealth. You'd think you'd get sucked up into that, right? He's the prince of Egypt. He could have become the Paro. All that wealth, money, dancing girls, whatever you want. Remember, as a baby, he's taken away from his mother and his family. It has nothing to do with his family. He does know that he's an Ivri. He's a Hebrew. He's different because his adopting mother, Batya, knows it's a Hebrew baby. Somehow that slipped by Paro and allowed him to be in the palace. He grew up as a prince. All the material seductions, access to whatever he wanted, become a god. So even though he grew up in the palace, he remained outwardly focused. He wasn't focused on his own selfish gratification. He was worried about his people. And we have the whole story about going out into the street and seeing the Hebrews being beaten, and he kills the taskmaster. But we call Moshe the humblest of all people. He was the greatest of all prophets and the humblest of all people. It's not a coincidence. Actually, they go hand in hand. Because the prerequisite of being objective about the reality of the world is getting your ego out of the way. If I want to connect to Hashem and hear what Hashem has to say, what God has to say, I have to shut down what I have to say. If I can get my ego out of the way, the more I get my ego out of the way, which we call humility, which means I want to do the right thing. It doesn't mean I'm a nebuch. Doesn't mean I'm wimpy. It just means I'm egoless. Moshe wasn't wimpy, right? He stood up to Paro. But he stood up to Paro because that was God's will, not his will. What was his will? I don't want to go and talk to Paro. I have a problem speaking. I'm the wrong guy. From my point of view, I'm the worst guy to send to Paro. What does God say? No, you're the right guy. So what does Moshe do? He went, because who cares what he has to say? What God has to say is important. That's what it means to be the humblest of all people. Not to be the humble. I don't want to be I'm not going to be the leader. No, he's going to be the leader if it's the right objective thing to do. That's what a humble person is. All right. So he becomes the greatest of prophets as a result. And therefore he earned the merit to redeem the Jewish people, the children of Israel, and lead them to nationhood and lead them to begin their mission according to the instructions of God. Because as a translator, look, he's a translator of what God has to say to the Jewish people. You know, they're in our cousins in the Arab world, if you get a translator slightly diverts, they'll kill him. If slightly the word of the king gets misinterpreted through the interpreter, he's dead. The interpreter is supposed to be a crystal clear channel with no subjective opinion on the matter, and just be a conduit. That's what the greatest of the prophets is. He's a pure conduit of God's will. Okay, now I want to talk about prophecy. There's a lot of confusion about prophecy. I'm just going to stop sharing here for a minute. And it's a pet peeve of mine. And I know a lot of you might get upset with what I'm about to say, but I'm giving you the Torah point of view about this. You know, I'm constantly getting people telling me, you know, God spoke to me yesterday, God spoke to me last night. You know, I'm constantly getting people telling me that. And I understand what prophecy is. In our generation, in our day and age, we do not have prophecy. Prophecy is not a happening. Prophecy is something that's earned, right? God is constantly broadcasting. God is transmitting. He's the ultimate transmitter. He's broadcasting constantly his will into the world. It's being transmitted in. We're filters. We're trying to be receivers, and we misperceive. We think God's angry when he's not really angry. Because in our subjective view, let 1.5 million children die in the Holocaust? That's cruel. How could you do such a thing? We don't understand, right? We're projecting our subjective reality onto the situation and misunderstanding. To be a prophet, you need to have your ego totally out of the way. So many times when people say to me, God spoke to me and here's what he said I should do, if we stripped it away, do you think they really want to do that? Yeah, they really want to do that, right? Somehow they figured out how God's telling them to do what they really wanted to do. There's a famous Hasidic story. I'm going to tell you a quick story. There were a Hasidic Rebbe, the leader of a dynasty, and he passed away and he had 3 sons. And the 3 sons are all arguing about the father. The father didn't leave a living will, about who he wanted to take over the Hasidic dynasty. So the 3 brothers are arguing. Oh, one says, oh, I know, Tati, he wanted me to take over because he learned with me on Saturday afternoons. And there was no, Tati, he wanted me to take over because he had me write the checks with the checkbook. No, Tati wanted me to be the leader. I had to take over because he gave me all these tasks to do to take care of the poor people in town. And they're fighting, the 3 brothers, about who's going to be the one to take over. So the next day, one of the brothers comes and he goes, it's over. I know who Tati wanted to be the leader. So the 2 brothers say, who? He says, me. Tati came to me in a dream last night. Tati means daddy. Tati came to me in a dream last night, and he said, I should be the one to take over. So the other 2 brothers lean forward and they say, if Tati wanted you to be the leader, he would have come to us in a dream and told us last night that you're going to be the leader. Okay? So that's exactly what happened at Mount Sinai. That's exactly what happened at Mount Sinai, and that's going to explain to us what happened and why it happened the way it happened. Okay? So prophecy is not a happening. God is broadcasting. We have to receive it. Not everything can receive. If you want to receive the television signal, or if you want to receive this signal, you need to build a computer and you need to hook it up to a Wi-Fi, right? If your Wi-Fi is not working properly, you're getting no reception. You're not getting the message. You can't just walk around in your house right now and hear me speaking here in Yavniel. You need to have a receiver that's very complicated and designed and built. You know what a prophet is? A prophet is somebody that turns themselves into this super egoless, wise receiver of what God's broadcasting. If you're not focused in exactly on the right channel, you're getting nothing. And if you do focus in and you do it, you're going to hear the broadcast. There were simultaneous prophecies. At the time when Eliyahu Navi, Elijah the prophet, was going to die, Elisha was his sidekick, Elisha the prophet. And they're walking through the countryside. And there's prophets in the countryside in those days. We can talk, you train to be a prophet. This is not happening. You want to get a black belt, you got to put in 10,000 hours to get a black belt in karate. You want to be a prophet, you got to put in the hours and the time and apprentice to become a prophet. It just doesn't happen. So they're saying, oh, Elisha, we hear your Rebbe's going today, as they're going through the countryside. They all knew the broadcast was out. If you were tuned into the channel, you heard the broadcast. Okay, getting sidetracked. So prophecy's not happening. The humbler they get, the greater you're going to be able to receive the message. And if you've got a dial-up connection right now, you might have to turn off the video and only get the audio. Or it might be fuzzy, right? The better your connection. So it's not all or nothing. There's going to be levels of receiving the broadcast also. The higher the level, the more crystal clear, high speed thing you got, the crystal clear, high resolution video, you're going to see every detail and you're going to hear everything perfectly. That's Moses. That's Moshe. Okay. Prophet is called a Navi. Navi, there it is. That word means, lavo means to come, lahavi means to bring, Navi we shall bring. A Navi is not a happening. A Navi is somebody that goes up and brings the message down. He turns himself into the vessel. This is what we said here. So the regular, now listen, at the beginning, it's not all or nothing, and it doesn't happen right away. It goes step by step. At the beginning of the prophecy, the prophet's going to get a snippet of a message. A regular prophecy is accomplished usually through a vision. A prophet goes into a trance-like state. Or could be in a dream, but they are crystal clear that they're having a prophecy and not a dream. We saw Abraham had a night vision. Abraham had a night vision. And they have this visual image. They understand crystal clear what it means without words, and then they reveal their prophecy in their own words. So that's Isaiah, Ezekiel, Jeremiah, every single prophet that you know. When they say, and God said to me and revealed to me, and right, they had a visual image in a trance-like state or a dream-like state. They saw their image, and now they articulated in their words what they saw. That's every other prophet except for Moshe. Moses' prophecy was unique. He had full oral prophecy, not being in a dream state. He was in a fully conscious state, and he could hear it. That's the highest level, the oral, because the oral you're getting more details, direct details. In the beginning, what happened though, Moshe comes, I don't have the verse here, you look it up on yourself, in Exodus 3:2. Moshe comes, and what does he do? He sees a bush that's burning, something that's an impossibility in the physical world. He's seeing a spiritual image. You see what I'm saying? His first glimpse of prophecy is a visual image. And when we see it's not burning the bush, we know it's a spiritual prophetic image that he's seeing. Then he hears a glimpse of a voice, Moshe, Moshe. By the time we're going to get to Sinai, he has been developing himself as a prophet, becoming better and better and habituated to it, that he becomes used to it and becomes expert at it. At the beginning, he's shocked. When he sees the bush burning, it's unnerving when you're locked in a physical body and you're having this prophetic experience. It is unnerving. And if it becomes too intense of an experience, it's deadly. We're going to see that in a minute. Okay, so prophecy is an intense spiritual experience which can be traumatic for the body if the prophet is not practiced. Through time, Moses perfected his ability to prophesy. All right, let's get to the nation of Israel. The nation of Israel. We have to become a kingdom of priests. And we're going to live dedicated to building our relationship with the Almighty. In order to accomplish that, what do we need? Instructions. Remember, constitution, body of law, details. We got to run a society here, but not according to how we think it should be run, how it objectively should be run. Remember what's going on in America today, people? You have one half of America saying, oh, you guys don't want to run it the way it's supposed to be run by the original people. You want to do it the way you feel it should be run. You want to make up the rules to adapt to your life today. And the other half is saying, no, we want to run it according to how some subjective people did a couple hundred years ago, right? That might have been a little bit closer to what Torah says. Right? Because again, the only objective reality of how to run a society that's going to be one nation under God is going to be using the rules that God determines, not what we took a little bit of here and adapted it and changed it, right? So the Jewish people are the one nation under God that are supposed to teach the world about God. So we need the user's guide. We need the Constitution. We need it. Where are we going to get it from? God. How do you get it from God? By being a prophet. Are they prophets yet? They're all slaves. They just came out of Egypt. They were at the lowest of the low. They believed that Paro was a god, that they were never going to get out of there, right? But God did something for them. He took them through the Exodus. They had this whole experience. They got 49 days to get rid of the slave mentality. But God says, okay, I want to give it to you, right? The problem is they're not going to be capable of receiving it. Do you understand? In order to receive all the details that you need to know of the Constitution and the body of law, you need to be able to hear all the details from God, the manufacturer. In order to do that, you have to be at the highest level of the highest of prophecy. Who's capable of doing that at this point in history? Moshe. He's capable of doing it. He's elevated himself where he can actually hear prophetically an oral communication and take dictation. Moshe is capable of doing it at this point in history. He's achieved the highest level of prophecy. The rest of the people, no. Now let's go back to our story about the Hasidim. Remember? I'm just going to stop sharing. Remember that story about the Hasidic dynasty? God wants to transmit. And all of a sudden, Moshe comes along and says, oh, God talked to me in a dream. And he said, and actually he didn't talk to me in a dream. I was fully awake. And God, you know what God told me? No pork. No shellfish, no shrimp, no lobster. You can't have milk and meat. You can't eat whatever animal you want. No bats. You got to rest on Shabbat. Can't work. Moshe starts spouting all this stuff. What's going to happen with the stiff-necked people? A mob. They'll kill him like they killed Jeremiah. You know what I mean? They'll rebel. Who says you? Who picked you? Remember Korach and his rebellion? Moshe. Who picked you? Nepotism. You and your brother Aaron. Who picked you? You'd already forgotten, right? So God knows this. God knows this. How is he going to communicate to the entire nation the Constitution and the body of the law that they need in order to live as one nation under God in the land and get them to accept it when they can't hear it from God directly? He's going to have to do it through Moshe. So what does he have to do? Look what God says. It's unbelievable. Look what God says in his own words. I'm going to share my screen now. This is going to blow you away. The real purpose of the national revelation. Moses at this point was perfectly capable, right? But would the stiff-necked people believe that all the details were from God and not made up by Moshe? It was crucial that the people believe in Moshe and his prophecy. So what does God say to Moshe in Exodus 19:19? V'yomer Hashem el Moshe. God says to Moshe, Hinei anochi ba'elecha. I hear, I'm coming to you. Ba'av ha'anan, in the thickness of the cloud. Why? Ba'avur ishma ha'am b'dabri imach. So that the nation will hear me speaking with you. And therefore, in you they will also believe. Forever. V'yaged Moshe et divrei ha'am el Hashem. And God related the message that the Jewish people said, where they said, we'll listen to what God says. Do you see what the whole purpose of the national revelation was? So that the people would experience the prophecy, not at the level of Moshe, but realize there was something prophetic going on. And therefore, when they did it with Moshe and they experienced it, they would believe when Moshe came down with all of the rules and all of the details, they would understand it was coming from God because they experienced themselves as a nation. Unbelievable. And now Revelation begins, right? What does it say? V'yadaber Elokim et kol hadvarim ha'el. It doesn't say commandments. It says God said all of these words or utterances. All. It says all at once. And what does he say? Anochi Hashem Elokecha. I'm the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt from the house of bondage, the house of slavery. That's the first commandment. We talked about that in the last seminar. You can look at it. If you didn't see it, you can review it. I have it on tape. Lo yelecha Elokim acharim al panai. You shall not have any gods before me. That's it. We call those the first two commandments. Now, what happened? After so I want to skip down here. Look what happened. Here's the nation. The kol ha'am ro'im. All of the people saw. It was a visual experience, their prophecy. They saw the voice. You're going to understand now why, because they're at a lower level of prophecy. They can't hear the prophecy coming from God. They're seeing a vision. They saw the kolot. They saw the voice or the thunder, right? Kolot means the sounds and our voice. And the lapidim, the flames, the light, sound and light. That kol hashofar and the voice of the shofar, and the mountain is in smoke. And what happened? They freaked out. Vayar ha'am. They freaked out. V'yanu yamdu mirachot, just like Moshe Rabbeinu when he saw the burning bush. But imagine you see a burning bush and you go, whoa. They step back and and look what they say to him. V'yamru el Moshe, daber ata imanu v'nishma'el v'al yadaber imanu elokim pen namut. This is such an intense experience. Moses, our souls are going to explode out of our bodies. We're going to die. We can't handle this. Moshe, please, you go talk to God. You have your oral thing. You're used to this. If we continue this one more moment, we're all dead. And Moshe says to the nation, Al tirau, don't be afraid. Ki leba'avur nasot etchem ba Elokim. God came to test you. Don't worry. This whole experience that you're having right now that's not natural because you didn't prepare for it really. You're not really prophets, but it's being forced on you. It's only happening to you in order to test you so you'll understand. And what does Moshe say? In order that you fear God, may ever be with you so that you will not go astray. Look what Moshe did. He did what Sarah did. He didn't want to say to them, he did all this so you'd believe in me, Moshe. That's what God did it for. He said, no, he did this so that you'll believe in him forever and God forever. That's Moses' humility. He didn't want to inject himself into it, even though the whole point of this experience was for them to believe in Moshe and his prophecy, that they would experience this and realize what prophecy is and that it's true and it's really God, and that when Moshe comes back, they'll believe in it. Unbelievable. So the people stood at a distance while Moshe went into the cloud where God was, and God said to Moses, this is what you should say to the people. You yourselves saw that I spoke to you from the very heavens. See that? There's the word. You saw, right? You saw that I spoke. They didn't hear that he spoke. They saw that he spoke. And now what does he do? Lo ta'asun iti Elohei kesef. You shouldn't make with me gods of silver, gods of gold. You shall not do. You should have a pillar, an altar of earth. You can be sacrificed. Blah, blah, blah. Detail. Wait, what did he say? They only heard the first two commandments. After the first two, they didn't hear the rest of the 8. They said, Moshe, you go hear the rest of us and tell it to us. But they heard the first two, which is the essence of monotheism. I'm your God. There's no gods before me. I took you out of Egypt. I'm all powerful. There's no power in the world other than me. You know that that's true. You experienced it. Have no other gods before me. What does it mean, have no other gods before me? So the principle is there. This is an example now of Moshe going and getting the details of the law that he's going to communicate to them orally. In this case, it's written down in the physical 5 books of Moses. But we're going to have lots of ones. God says, slaughter the animal. You want to eat a kosher cow? Slaughter the animal in the way that I've shown you. That's all it says in the Torah. How the heck do you slaughter a cow? In the way that I've shown you. We need to have Moshe tell the elders, and the elders tell the next generation. They tell the next generation. They tell the next how to do the details, right? Do the details of that principle. The Torah is only 304,805 letters, 90,000 words, like a small novel. How do you get everything in there? It's a user's guide. It's not the manual. It's not the legal code. Sorry, I'm getting excited. We're almost finished. It's 8:02. Okay, I'm going a little over. I'm sorry. So for 40 years, there was continuing revelation, people. I'll say this outside now. You can look at it in the notes on your own. What happens? Moses goes up for 40 days and 40 nights, and then another 40 days and 40 nights. What are you doing? Getting details. And then he comes down, and as events are happening, he writes them down, letter by letter, word for word, as dictated. The entire 5 books, when you read the story about Abraham and about Noah and about Adam, this is not Moshe telling stories he heard. This is Moshe taking dictation. God says, I want this story about Abraham being revealed for all time. Take a letter. Write this down. And he ends up with a sefer. You know what a scribe is called? There's 304,805 letters. 304,805 letters in the 5 books of Moses. You know what a scribe is called? A sofer. Sofer. You know what it means, sofer? To count. The essential job of a sofer is to count the letters when they're copying a Sefer Torah, to make sure he didn't miss one letter, to make sure there's 304,805 letters. We can't lose one letter. It's holy because it was dictated by the Almighty King of the universe. All right. So what does Moshe do? He goes up and then he comes down. And as the stories are happening, he takes dictation how the story is supposed to be written down, why God wants it written this way. Now, I want to let you know something else here. The people there's 613 commandments. In the desert, they are keeping Shabbat. In the desert, they are slaughtering animals according to kosher slaughter. In the desert, they are doing the laws of not taking interest payments, of loving their neighbor. They're doing the 613 commandments. When did they get the Torah? 40 years later. What came first, the written law or the oral law? The oral law came first. The oral law is the 613 commandments, how you live your life in your Jewish society in the land of Israel. They couldn't keep them all because they weren't in the land yet, because a lot of the mitzvahs are applied to the land. The oral law came first, then the written. The oral law. My Rosh Hashiva used to say to us, the head of my yeshiva, if you had your choice, what would you give up, the written law or the oral law? Give up the written law. You can't live without the oral law. If you just have the written law and not the oral law, you can make up any religion you want, make up all the rules that you want. It's so vague. Oh, let's rest on the Sabbath. So that means we'll go drive to the tennis courts and play tennis. You need the oral law. Otherwise, you don't know what Shabbat is. The written law is useless without the oral law. With the oral law and without the written law, they were living a perfectly good monotheistic spiritual life. And we can. Okay. So the final Torah scroll has the 304,805 letters. The detailed laws of the 630 commandments are transmitted for 1,500 years until when the Romans started murdering off all of our rabbis in the 1st century. There was a danger that it would be lost or confused, and Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi decided to publish it. But he published it in very telegraphic words so that the actual laws wouldn't be forgotten, but all the details still were being transmitted orally. So that's called the Mishnah. And then 200 years later, because we were in exile in Babylon, by that time, certain agricultural terminology was being lost, so they decided to codify what's called the Gemara, which is the teaching on the Mishnah that was handed down, and that's codified and called the Talmud. That was a sad day for the Jewish people when it was codified. Why? Because it's supposed to stay dynamic. The principles apply, but the principles always stay, but the application is different for teaching. If you want to teach the laws of damages, if I want to teach you guys the laws of damages in 2020, right? Does it help that I say, well, what happens if your ox gores somebody else's ox? Who's got an ox today? The principle is if your property damages, if your Toyota rolls down off of your driveway into the street and bangs into the neighbor's Honda across the street, do you owe it? Or was it an accident? Or do you have to pay for the damages? Your property did damage. Do you owe, right? Now, isn't it better if I use that analogy than your gore or ox goring somebody's other gore? Or if somebody's animal fell into your pit, right? But because it's fixed and published, we're stuck with those analogies, and now we have to do it. So it's double work instead of being a living thing of applying principles of law. All right. So for the next 1,800 years after that, it's faithfully transmitted from teacher to student, teacher to student, teacher to student, teacher to student, teacher to student. That's what we call a real rabbi. There's a lot of charlatans out there that aren't connected with this 3,300-year-old tradition directly all the way back to Sinai. And people keep throwing people at me, calling themselves rabbis. I'd say, who'd you learn from? You know, I want to get my rabbi's family tree. I saw it once physically. Now maybe it's online. It goes all the way back to King David, all the way back to Adam. Hello? It's an unbroken chain. Somebody wants to come in and not be part of that chain of transmission of the real truth, call himself a rabbi, excuse me. That's a charlatan. So in conclusion, on the festival of Shavuot, what we call Zman Matan Toratenu, the time of the giving of our Torah, what are we commemorating? What we're commemorating is this is the beginning of the receiving of our oral tradition, our oral Torah, which are the detailed instructions for living a God-centric, purposeful life that emerge from the first two utterances. Because these two statements, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, the house of bondage, you shall have no other gods beside me. If you go through, you'll see how the other 8 commandments are an emergent property of these two principles. When you can take these two principles and ultimately extrapolate and build, if you're trying to build a God-centric society, ultimately all of the 613 principles that are going to relate to a nation. That's what the sages say Abraham did. They say Abraham, through subjective analysis of the world and how the world should operate, was keeping even the rabbinical mitzvahs that we have, even the rabbinical commands. When the rabbis say separate chicken from cheese, you know what I mean? It's like as a fence to make sure you don't have a kid in its mother's milk. All these fences, even he was keeping fences, Abraham, because when you look at an objective reality and how society works, you'll naturally do those things. So that's what I wanted to say today, and I'll open it up for questions. I know it was a lot, but I have everything written down. You're going to get the notes on the replay. You're going to get this video again. And okay, who's got a question?
So what did they receive?
Who's asking? Alice? Yeah, so the Jewish
Yes,
people, the Jewish people had a prophetic experience. All they had was a prophetic experience that was visual. That from that visual experience, they understood that there is a God.
Right.
That he was the one that brought them out of Egypt, and that there is no power in the world that exists independent of God. That's what they became. They had total clarity on it. And then they shut down and they said, Moshe, you do the rest. And you'll teach us. That's why we call him Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe, our teacher. That's why Moses is called our teacher. And he's the ultimate teacher because he's not projecting any of his subjectivity onto it. He's just a conduit. So yeah. That's what we got. But those two statements encompass all of Torah, because when we're using Torah is the rules, the instructions on how to connect to the Almighty. That's the essence of it.
Right.
So we got the essence of Torah at Sinai.
And Moses wrote the books that didn't happen before it happened. I didn't get that.
Sorry, what was the question? You cut out.
So the question is, you said that the 5 books of Moses were given to Moshe. So how did he know he was going to do the rest of the things in the future?
He didn't know.
So
again, it's impossible that he wrote it down before it happened. So there's 2 opinions that the sages have. One is, as the things occurred, he wrote them down. And then at the end in Deuteronomy, when he gets to his death, 9 lines before the end, he stops and Yoshua writes it out, or there's another tradition that says he wrote it out without the spaces so he didn't have to read about his own impending death. And Joshua put in the spaces on those 9 verses. But 2 approaches. He waited until the end of 40 years and wrote it start to finish. Or after Revelation at Sinai, he wrote up everything up until the Revelation. And then from time to time, he wrote chapters down from time to time when he went into the tent. Those are the 2 opinions. Okay, you guys are amazing. Thank you very much for being so patient and enjoying. Charles, nice to see you. I want to thank you all for supporting us and making it possible. God willing, I'm going to bring in more guest speakers. I think next week I'm going to bring in my friend Shraga Simmons, Rabbi Shraga Simmons, unbelievable. He's another one of my chavruta. I learned through a lot of the books of the prophets with him. Amazing. And he's one of the main writers at Aish.com. A lot of you might have written a lot of his articles not realizing he did them. Amazing articulator of Jewish thought. And we're going to do a deep dive on Abraham. We're going to go deep dive into Abraham, who he was, the stories you don't read in the Bible that are hinted at in the Bible. So you'll get a fuller picture of who this founder of monotheism as we understand it in the world is. So God willing, I'll send you out information about that. And thank you all very much for helping me have a more meaningful Shavuot. It's going to be a special Shavuot for me because you forced me to do all this preparation. So we'll see you on the other side. For everybody who's celebrating Chag Shavuot Sameach and Shabbat Shalom. And we'll see you all the next time. Thank you.